Gray's calculation of the distance covered during the march has been debated, with his estimates being slightly off by about 0.3 to 0.8 of a mile. While this discrepancy isn't significant, it does raise questions about his methodology. What stands out more, however, is Gray's use of local time, which when converted to St. Paul time, results in a departure at 1:50 a.m. and an arrival at 4:12 a.m. These times seem somewhat disconnected from the first-hand accounts provided by those who were actually present during the march. Although Gray's figures are close to the mark, they can feel somewhat forced when compared to Gerard's notes and the other testimonies that emerge from the soldiers and scouts. Benteen and Moylan, though not leading the regiment, were positioned near the front. Moylan's own estimate of leaving at 11 p.m. and halting at 1:30 a.m. suggests a pace of roughly 2.68 miles per hour, which closely aligns with Gray's assessment. However, despite the similarity in calculated pace, the specific times reported differ. Based on the broader timeline of leaving at 11 p.m. and halting at 2:15 a.m., a slower pace, between 1.9 to 2.1 miles per hour, seems more realistic, taking into account the difficult terrain, the darkness, and the repeated delays caused by the pack mules. One unfortunate element in the historical record is the absence of a more direct account from Keogh, whose role during this phase of the campaign remains somewhat enigmatic. However, there is fragile evidence that hints at his involvement. First Sergeant John Ryan of M Company made an allusion to the arrangement of the pack mules, suggesting that Companies C and M were under Keogh's command. This implies that Keogh had a significant role in managing the rear elements of the column, dealing with the logistical challenges that came with the mule train. As for the warnings issued to Custer, some sources suggest that Fred Gerard reported Half Yellowface and Bloody Knife warning Custer that they wouldn't be able to cross the divide before daylight without being spotted by Sioux scouts. This claim, however, raises questions, especially regarding Bloody Knife's knowledge of the terrain. As a re-scout, Bloody Knife would not have been as familiar with this particular region, making his warning seem less credible. It's possible that Half Yellowface, who knew the land far better, could have been the source of the warning, with Bloody Knife merely relaying the concerns. The claim about assembling at the Busby halt has also been taken out of context in some accounts, reflecting the sloppy scholarship that often surrounds this event. Some historians have misinterpreted the timeline and the nature of the halt, leading to confusion about the order of events. According to Gerard's account, the column likely departed around 11:30 p.m., after which he, Half Yellowface, and Bloody Knife moved to the front to scout ahead while waiting for Custer to arrive. When Custer eventually caught up, he instructed Gerard to scout far to the left, setting the stage for the complex maneuvers that followed. This mix of first-hand accounts, speculative analysis, and conflicting timelines makes reconstructing the exact sequence of events difficult. What is clear, however, is that the confusion surrounding the precise timing of the march reflects the chaos and uncertainty of that night. While some figures like Moylan and Gerard offer relatively consistent accounts, the discrepancies between Gray's calculations, Gerard's notes, and the testimonies of others remind us that even in the best historical scholarship, some aspects of the past remain elusive. Ultimately, it's the larger picture, the struggle to maintain order in the darkness, the repeated delays caused by the pack animals, the warnings from the scouts, and the decision to halt before daylight that tells the real story of that night. The minutiae of the exact times and distances, while valuable to historians, may ultimately be less important than understanding the overall dynamics of the column's movement and the challenges they faced as they marched towards the divide. In this light, the historical record becomes less about pinpointing specific moments and more about grasping the broader patterns of action, decision-making, and adaptation in the face of adversity. The unfolding of events surrounding Custer's ill-fated campaign against the Sioux and Cheyenne has long been a puzzle pieced together from scattered testimonies and vague recollections. One such moment, steeped in both confusion and intrigue, is the halt made by Custer in the early hours of the morning, as scouts like Gerard were sent out to locate the trail ahead. According to accounts, this pause occurred around 2 a.m., and it was here that Custer asked his scouts whether they could cross the divide before daylight. Both Half Yellowface and Bloody Knife, though the latter was not as familiar with the territory, told him they would not make it before dawn. This exchange reflects Custer's growing awareness of the dangers ahead. If they were spotted in daylight by the Sioux Scouts, their mission could be compromised before it even truly began. Reno's timeline places this exchange around 2 a.m., which makes sense given that this aligns with the other accounts of when the regiment halted. However, Reno's timeline is often scrutinized for its inconsistencies, and this particular detail, though minor, points to a larger issue of timing throughout the entire campaign. The difficulty of moving the column across the divide undetected forced Custer to make a critical decision. He would push forward, but not with his entire force. As Custer and his main column began moving up Davis Creek, Lieutenant Varnum and his scouts were already far ahead, advancing toward what was referred to as the Crow's Nest. Interestingly, the term Crow's Nest is something of a misnomer. The actual location was more of a natural bowl or pocket, used by Crow Indians for horse theft. It wasn't a towering lookout that offered a panoramic view of the valleys below, but rather a low-lying feature that offered limited visibility, especially to the west, the direction of Custer's march. In fact, Varnum and his scouts had to climb on foot to reach the summit of a nearby hill to get a better view of the surrounding landscape. Exhausted from their journey, Varnum collapsed and fell asleep, as it was too dark to see anything useful at that hour anyway. There is some debate over whether Varnum and his scouts actually reached the true Crow's Nest at all. Author Vern Smalley suggested that the Crow scouts guiding Varnum's party got lost in the darkness and ended up somewhere on the divide instead. Ashamed of this misstep, they may have lied about their location in the years that followed. Smalley supported this theory with Varnum's own comments about how he approached the summit, implying that they may not have been in the exact location they claimed. The confusion surrounding this location only adds to the murkiness of the campaign's timeline, leaving historians to wonder exactly where Varnum and Custer were positioned when they tried to survey the valleys below. Historian James Willard posited that Custer and his scouts were positioned on a rounded, oval-shaped hill southeast of where the trail crossed the divide, about half a mile from the camp marker. This hill, Willard argued, offered a comparable view to the higher peak that would later be associated with the Crow's Nest. It was an accessible point from the trail, with tall grass and pine trees that provided cover, making it a logical place for an observation point. Another historian, Edgar Stewart, was less certain, suggesting instead that Custer and his scouts were likely stationed at the fourth peak south of the pass. These competing theories highlight the confusion over the exact geography of the area and reflect the difficulties in piecing together a clear narrative of the campaign's movements. One of the most debated aspects of this phase of the campaign is the issue of timing. Varnum, Boyer, and White Man runs him reach the Crow's Nest, or what they believe to be the Crow's Nest, some 5 hours after leaving Busby Camp. Their progress was slow, barely covering 2 miles per hour, which can be attributed to the Crow Scouts pausing for a smoke break in the thick brush by the stream. Despite the slow pace, there was no sense of urgency since there were still several hours of darkness left. By the time they reached the summit, civil twilight was approaching. It was around 3:30 a.m. when Harry Moccasin and White Man Runzem climbed to the top of the hill and noticed what seemed to be a faint glow of campfires against the early morning sky. They hurried back with the news. However, Varnum, suffering from sore eyes due to lack of sleep and dust from the ride, had difficulty seeing clearly from the heights. 2 abandoned teepees were also spotted along Ash or Reno Creek, likely with the aid of telescopes since they were several miles away. Varnum jotted down a note containing this information and handed it to Red Star, a young Ree scout, to deliver to Custer. Here, discrepancies emerge. Smalley claimed that Varnum sent the note around 3:45 a.m., while others suggest it was closer to 4 a.m. Varnum himself later stated that he sent the messengers just after 5 a.m., which seems more plausible given how long it took for visibility to improve. Varnum's comment, around 5 o'clock, I wrote a note to the general, suggests that while sunrise was officially at 4:13 a.m., from their elevated position, it likely felt later. The hazy, dim sky made it difficult to observe much, especially for a weary and sleep-deprived Varnum. It's possible that he preferred not to report anything prematurely without being certain, despite the Crow Scouts' insistence that they had spotted campfires. This confusion over timing highlights the relatively low importance placed on exact times during the campaign. Varnum, seasoned by frontier life, had likely internalized general sunrise patterns and relied more on his instincts than on his watch to dictate his actions. His reference to 5 o'clock may have been based on military headquarters time, which would have actually been around 4 or even 3 a.m. locally, too dark for detailed observations. This recurring issue of local versus headquarters time complicates many of the records, making it difficult to determine exact timelines with any certainty. The journey from the Crow's Nest to Custer's initial halt was only about 4.5 miles, an easy trek in daylight. A fast rider could cover the ground in less than 45 minutes. Yet accounts vary regarding how long it took Red Star to deliver the note. Red Star himself claimed that despite his companion's horse going lame, he pushed forward with urgency, understanding the importance of his mission. As a young man between 18 and 22 years old, this mission was a badge of honor for him, reflecting the trust placed in him by the white soldiers. Upon arrival at Custer's camp, he was greeted warmly by his fellow Scouts, who understood the significance of his task. Writers like Jack Pennington and James Willard give credence to Red Star's version of events, noting that he observed the sun's position upon reaching camp around 6 a.m. If Varnum had sent the note at 5 a.m., it is reasonable to believe that Red Star could have reached Custer by 6 a.m., especially considering his determination despite the setback with Bull's horse. Meanwhile, as Red Star delivered the note, Varnum scouts observed Sioux warriors moving about 1.5 miles to the west, toward the soldiers' camp. Fearing that the Sioux might spot the troops' campfires and reveal their position, Varnum led a small group to intercept them. However, just as they set off, the Sioux changed direction, rendering the pursuit unnecessary. The scouts then watched as the Sioux crossed the divide and shifted their course once again, this time heading towards a gap in the terrain. By this time, Red Star had reportedly arrived at camp, signaling the discovery of the Sioux encampment and setting the stage for the final, fateful confrontation. The casual attitude Red Star displayed about Bull's lame horse is indeed intriguing and adds credibility to his account of the urgency with which he delivered Varnum's message. Despite the hindrance of the injured horse, Red Star seems to have pushed forward with a sense of purpose, understanding the importance of his mission. His determination suggests that while he may have been delayed slightly by Bull's horse, he still managed to maintain a steady pace. The estimation of him trotting at around 7 miles per hour fits within the context of his journey, especially considering that the terrain, while challenging, was navigable at that speed with occasional pauses to ensure Bull's welfare. White Man Runsim's claim that Custer reached the Crow's Nest by 6 a.m. further supports the idea that Red Star truly hustled to deliver the message. Indian timing, often considered less precise when translated into Western terms, aligns reasonably well in this case with known distances and travel times. Given the estimated 4.5 miles between the Crow's Nest and Custer's camp, Red Star's arrival around 6 a.m. makes sense if he departed around 5 a.m. and moved at a consistent pace, pausing only briefly to check on Bull's horse. The anecdotal evidence of Red Star first speaking with bloody knife upon arriving at the camp adds another layer of credibility to his story. Isaiah Dorman, the Dakota interpreter, reportedly noticed this interaction and alerted Private John Berkman to wake Custer. This sequence of events paints a vivid picture of the moment Red Star arrived with Varnum's crucial information. The urgency of the situation was palpable, with the realization dawning on Custer and his men that they were on the cusp of a significant encounter with the Sioux and Cheyenne. Once Custer received Varnum's note and heard Red Star's account of the situation, it triggered a flurry of activity within the camp. Custer, along with his brothers Tom and Boston, quickly began preparing for their next move. The fact that the entire command shifted its focus so rapidly underscores the importance of the information Red Star had delivered. The sighting of campfires, the presence of abandoned teepees along Ash or Reno Creek, and the sighting of Sioux warriors nearby all pointed to the imminent danger of discovery by their adversaries. The decision to move toward the Crow's Nest was a pivotal one, and it reflects Custer's characteristic boldness. He understood the need to gain a strategic advantage by surveying the area from a higher vantage point, and the crow's nest, despite its limitations, offered a relatively clear view of the surrounding valleys. Custer's reliance on scouts like Red Star, White Man Runs Him, and Bloody Knife in these critical moments highlights the importance of indigenous knowledge and expertise during the campaign. Even as Custer prepared to engage in a battle that would pit him against the very people whose assistance he relied on. The energy within the camp was undoubtedly tense, but focused. Custer and his brothers were seasoned soldiers, and they understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The march toward the crow's nest was not just a physical movement, but a symbolic step closer to the inevitable clash that would soon unfold on the battlefield. Red Star's hurried journey, the interactions between Bloody Knife and Dorman, and the swift actions of Custer and his men all set the stage for the final, tragic confrontation that history would forever remember as the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The events of that early morning reflect the relentless pace Custer set for his men, despite the lingering uncertainty over precise details such as formal orders and trumpet calls. After receiving Red Star's note confirming the location of the Sioux camp, Custer, known for his ability to function on little sleep, sprang into action. By around 7:20 a.m. local time, which corresponded to 8:17 a.m. headquarters time, Custer was likely rousing his men for the final push toward the enemy. Although some accounts suggest the presence of trumpet calls signaling the command to move, others, including Benteen, noted that they did not hear the familiar blasts. This discrepancy has been a point of contention among historians, illustrating the confusion that often accompanies chaotic military engagements. Nevertheless, Red Star's account of his swift return and the subsequent movements of Custer's men holds up well when cross-referenced with other credible sources. Although the timing based on local versus headquarters time requires careful consideration, Red Star's timing aligns with the overall framework of that morning. His ride and the subsequent flurry of activity around Custer appear to fit within the established narrative of the campaign. Lieutenant Godfrey's recollections add further insight into the timing of events, but his mention of covering 10 miles between 8 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. seems exaggerated. At face value, this suggests a pace of 4 miles per hour, a speed that is virtually impossible given the conditions, terrain, and the state of the soldiers and horses. This inconsistency raises doubts about the accuracy of Godfrey's entire account. Upon closer inspection, it becomes evident that Halt 1, which occurred at 2:15 a.m., was only about 4.5 miles from the crow's nest. Halt 2, where the march ultimately ended, was just 3.5 miles further along. Given these distances, the true pace of Custer's march that morning was far more moderate. It's likely that Godfrey misjudged either the distance or the speed of the column, as the regiment would have moved more slowly than his account suggests. The rugged terrain and the need to maintain cohesion among the troops and their horses would have limited their speed considerably, likely closer to 2 miles per hour rather than 4. Godfrey's error may stem from the natural distortion of memory over time, especially in the context of a battle as infamous as Little Bighorn. The vividness of the experience, the dust, the adrenaline, the pressing sense of urgency could easily have contributed to a skewed perception of the passage of time and distance. What remains consistent across most accounts, however, is the steady progression of Custer's forces after Red Star's return, from the crow's nest to the first halt, and then onward toward their final destination. The regiment's movements were methodical, even if not as fast as some recollections might suggest. The broader picture remains. Custer, after receiving critical intelligence from his scouts, wasted little time in preparing his men for what would ultimately become a legendary confrontation. While inconsistencies in the details of distance and timing persist, the overall flow of events paints a picture of a commander determined to press forward, confident in his strategy despite the looming dangers ahead. The critical takeaway is that Red Star's timely return set in motion the final march, leading Custer and his men inexorably toward their fateful encounter with the Sioux and Cheyenne. As the day broke on that fateful morning, Red Star's return brought critical information confirming the location of the Sioux camp. Custer, ever resilient despite his lack of sleep, immediately sprang into action. By approximately 7:20 a.m. local time, 8:17 a.m. headquarters time, he likely began rousing his men for what would be their final push toward the enemy. However, there remains ongoing debate regarding whether formal orders and trumpet calls were issued at this point. While some recollections suggest hearing the trumpet sound, others, such as Benteen, noted that no such signal was heard, adding a layer of uncertainty to an already tense situation. Nevertheless, Red Star's account of events and the timing of his ride fit well with other reliable sources. His urgency in delivering the note, combined with the known distances and the movements of the troops, suggests that his arrival around 6 a.m. and the subsequent mobilization of Custer's forces were well within the realm of possibility. The variations in local versus headquarters time add complexity to the analysis, but the general flow of events remains intact. Lieutenant Godfrey's recollections of the morning provide additional detail, though not without discrepancies. He noted that they began the march promptly at 8 a.m. and continued without stopping until 10:30 a.m., when they took a break in a ravine. According to Godfrey, the troops covered about 10 miles during this stretch, but this figure raises questions. Calculating the speed suggests a pace of 4 miles per hour, a figure that seems unrealistic given the conditions. The rough terrain, combined with the logistical difficulties of maintaining order within the column, would have likely resulted in a slower pace. In reality, Halt 1 was only about 4.5 miles from the Crow's Nest, while Halt 2, where the march concluded, was just another 3.5 miles further along. These distances suggest a more moderate pace of about 2 miles per hour, which is far more plausible given the situation. Godfrey's mention of 10 miles may have been an overestimation, possibly due to the fatigue and heightened stress of the moment. His perception of time and distance may have been skewed by the intensity of the march, a common occurrence in military campaigns where emotions and adrenaline distort the finer details of memory. Despite these inconsistencies, the overall timeline remains clear. Custer received critical intelligence from his scouts, prompting him to mobilize his forces for the final march. The lack of formal orders and trumpet calls could indicate the urgency of the situation, where speed and decisiveness outweighed the need for traditional signaling. Custer's men pushed forward, covering the necessary ground as they prepared for what would soon become one of the most infamous battles in U.S. military history. Red Star's timely return, Godfrey's observations, and the careful cross-referencing of timelines provide a coherent picture of the morning's events. While small details such as pace and distance may vary between accounts, the broader narrative remains intact. Custer, with his men prepared and scouts providing critical intelligence, was moving steadily toward the fateful encounter at Little Bighorn. The march that morning was not just a physical journey, but the final steps toward a historic confrontation that would forever mark the legacy of Custer and his troops. It's intriguing to consider how memory and the passage of time have influenced the various accounts of Custer's movements that morning. Godfrey, recalling events some 15 years after the fact, may have unintentionally merged different parts of the day together, leading to discrepancies in his recollection of the distance covered. His estimate of 10 miles between 8 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. seems excessive given the slower pace suggested by other officers. Miles Moylan confirmed the 8 a.m. departure time, while Luke Hare gave a looser estimate, placing it between 8 o'clock and 9 a.m. George Wallace's testimony fluctuated, initially placing the departure time between 8 o'clock and 8:45 a.m., before finally settling on 8:45 a.m. during the Reno inquiry. These variations are indeed curious, particularly for someone responsible for keeping an accurate itinerary. Benteen's recollection of traveling only a mile and a half before the next halt adds to the confusion, further suggesting that the officers may not have been describing the same segments of the march. Historian Vern Smalley's theory that Custer never actually climbed to the Crow's Nest is an interesting departure from traditional narratives. Smalley argues that Custer may have instead observed the valleys from a lower point, which he calls Varnum's Lookout. While Smalley's theory challenges the commonly accepted story, there is little concrete evidence to support it. Your personal observations from 2007 further challenge Smalley's theory, noting that the area identified as the location where horses were kept was too small and muddy to hold 15 horses without significant risk of injury. Additionally, while Varnum's Lookout offers a view of the surrounding area, It pales in comparison to the vantage point at Crow's Nest, which stands 400 feet higher and offers a far superior observation point. Given the choice, anyone conducting reconnaissance of the area would naturally gravitate toward the higher ground, especially for such a critical task. Fred Gerard's description at the Reno Inquiry, mentioning a small ravine and spring on the ascent to the lookout, seems to reinforce the idea that Crow's Nest was the more likely observation point. Gerard's testimony aligns with the traditional understanding that Custer, or at least some of his scouts, reached Crow's Nest for a better view of the valleys below. Historian James Willard shared Smalley's skepticism, suggesting that Custer may not have climbed all the way to the top and instead surveyed the valley from higher ground north of Davis Creek. However, despite these competing interpretations, dismissing Varnum's lookout entirely may be premature. It does reappear in other discussions, indicating that it played some role, even if not as the primary observation point. The discrepancies in these accounts highlight the inherent challenges of piecing together a coherent narrative from conflicting testimonies and imperfect memories. However, given the advantages of Crow's Nest in terms of height and visibility, it remains the most logical site for reconnaissance, even if questions about Custer's exact movements persist. Custer's scouting of the Reno Creek and Little Bighorn valleys is well documented, though the details of what he observed remain ambiguous. Despite the time he spent at Crow's Nest, it's clear that no immediate plans were solidified during this period. Accounts of his arrival atop Crow's Nest vary widely, with estimates ranging from shortly after 8:45 a.m. to as late as 9:30 a.m., depending on the source. This discrepancy raises questions about how a man as famously impatient as Custer could take nearly 2 hours to cover just 4 miles. Yet, the evidence suggests that he did not dawdle. Custer's actions that morning reveal his characteristic urgency. After receiving the message from Red Star, Custer wasted no time in rousing his men. By 8 a.m., he had already left camp, forging ahead, unwilling to wait for his regiment to catch up. His impatience, which had long been noted by his fellow officers, seems to have driven his decision to press forward rapidly. This urgency fits the broader pattern of Custer's behavior, as many officers attested to his inability to sit still, especially in the face of potential combat. The letters exchanged in 1925 between Graham, Varnum, and Edgerly shed further light on Custer's well-known impatience. When asked about an alleged 45-minute halt that Custer supposedly made after sending a message to Benteen while Reno's troops were engaged, Varnum quickly dismissed the idea, stating that anyone who knew Custer would find it hard to believe he could remain still for 5 minutes in such a situation. Edgerly shared this skepticism, further affirming that Custer's relentless drive to take action made the notion of a prolonged stop unlikely. This impulsiveness was a hallmark of Custer's leadership style, as described by General Allard Bayard Nettleton, a Civil War peer of Custer. Nettleton praised Custer's ability to make lightning-fast decisions and energize his troops in battle, a skill he had honed during the war. Custer's dynamic and sometimes rash command style made him a figure of great inspiration to his men, but it also contributed to the sense that he would push forward without hesitation, even if it meant leaving his regiment behind. In this light, the idea of Custer leisurely ascending to Crow's Nest becomes incongruous with the image of a commander driven by an almost compulsive need to act. Instead, Custer likely charged ahead, focused on gaining a vantage point as quickly as possible. This decision-making process, while effective in some cases, also foreshadowed the tragic events to come, as his haste and impatience would soon lead him directly into the heart of battle with fatal consequences for him and his men. The chaotic timeline of events leading up to Custer's arrival at Crow's Nest reflects the disarray and urgency that characterized much of his command. After Red Star's arrival at approximately 6:55 a.m., there was a brief moment of celebration among the scouts, followed by some small talk. By 7:05 a.m., Isaiah Dorman, the interpreter, had spotted Red Star and sent Private John Berkman to wake Custer. Custer, still groggy from sleep, was on his way to the scouts' camp by 7:20 a.m. Upon receiving Varnum's note and hearing the latest intelligence, Custer was quickly ready to act, and by 7:45 a.m., he was preparing to issue orders. By 8 a.m., preparations were underway, and true to his reputation for impatience, Custer set off by 8:10 a.m., covering the ground between his camp and Crow's Nest with urgency. Reaching the lookout's pocket by 8:35 a.m., Crow's Nest was an easily identifiable location, especially if one followed the tracks along the south edge of Davis Creek Valley, as Varnum had done. When Custer arrived, Varnum descended from the hill to greet him, while the horses were being corralled. By around 9 a.m., Custer was positioned at Crow's Nest, gazing out across the little Bighorn Valley through his eyeglass. Yet, curiously, the signs of a large village, which scouts had indicated, did not seem to leave much of an impression on him. In a letter to Walter Camp written years later in 1909, Varnum recalled how he, Custer, Tom Custer, and Lieutenant James Calhoun discussed the previous night's events and scouted the area together. However, Varnum's memories from that morning appear somewhat muddled. In his later memoirs, he omitted Calhoun from the account entirely, casting doubt on the accuracy of his earlier recollections. This inconsistency highlights the difficulty of reconstructing precise details from such a confusing and fragmented moment in history. What remains consistent across these accounts is Custer's characteristic tendency to act independently. He often rode ahead of his main column, eager to gather his own observations and make swift decisions without waiting for the rest of his regiment to catch up. This impulsive behavior, while a testament to his decisiveness, also created challenges for his command, which frequently struggled to keep pace with his rapid movements. At Crow's Nest, Custer's quick glance over the valley and his seeming dismissal of the threat lurking below would soon play a pivotal role in the events to come. His tendency to rely on his own instincts rather than the reports from his scouts and subordinates further illustrates the nature of his command style: bold, quick to act, and sometimes dismissive of potential risks. As the morning progressed, this approach would propel Custer and his men directly toward their fateful encounter, with little room for caution or reconsideration. As Custer took in the view from Crow's Nest, the rest of his regiment struggled with the slow, disorganized march that trailed far behind him. The delays were largely due to troublesome pack mules and confusion among the officers, who were left uncertain of the plan. Key figures like Lieutenant Cook, Major Reno, and Captain Benteen were all navigating the fog of uncertainty, as Custer, known for his independent and impulsive nature, pressed ahead without waiting for them to catch up. By the time Custer decided to depart from the overlook, it was likely already past 10 a.m., though officers like Godfrey, Hare, Moylan, and Wallace later claimed the command arrived between 10 o'clock and 10:30 a.m. Given Custer's type, a personality, and his eagerness to forge ahead, it seems unlikely that he would have taken over 2 hours to reach Crow's Nest, especially after a grueling 40-day campaign and a forced night march. This discrepancy suggests that the main body of the regiment arrived much later than Custer himself. Red Star's brief remark about Custer going back to meet the troops seems to support this timeline and raises questions about the accuracy of some of Varnum's later recollections. The difference in timing indicates that Custer's usual impatience led him to move well ahead of his regiment, leaving them to catch up as best they could. Varnum's post-battle memories also appear to contain inconsistencies, as highlighted by the story of Robert Jackson, a Ree-scout. According to Varnum, Jackson was among the scouts as the command moved along the Rosebud River. However, this claim is contradicted by an email from historian Vern Smalley in June 2006, which suggests that Jackson left the command on June 23rd to deliver letters home and reach the Yellowstone Depot by June 25th. Private Harvey Fox of D Company corroborated this, as he reportedly saw Jackson at the depot. This aligns with other accounts, including that of Private George Glenn of H Company, who remembered seeing Jackson at the mouth of the Rosebud, but not during the subsequent battles. Additionally, Scout George Herendine confirmed that Jackson was not present at the Little Bighorn on June 25th or 26th, but had returned to the Powder River Depot. These conflicting reports further cast doubt on Varnum's recollections and illustrate the complexities of reconstructing historical events. The post-battle narratives, while valuable, are often tinged with the inevitable distortions that come with time and the fog of war. The confusion and uncertainty among Custer's officers during this phase of the campaign reflect the breakdown of communication that plagued the regiment. Custer's tendency to act independently and leave others behind contributed to the disorganization that slowed the advance of his troops. The officers, left without clear direction, were forced to manage as best they could while their commander raced ahead to confront what would soon be his, and their, fate at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The conflicting accounts surrounding Robert Jackson, as confirmed by Young Hawk and other re-scouts, make it clear that Jackson was not present during the crucial moments leading up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but instead returned to the camp after the battle had concluded. This suggests Jackson had either been discharged or re-enlisted by June 25th, further supporting the notion that he was not with the command during the final stages of Custer's ill-fated campaign. In the midst of these events, other significant occurrences unfolded, including an incident reported by Sergeant William Curtis from Captain Yates' Company F. According to Miles Moylan's testimony at Reno's inquiry, Curtis realized that some of his gear was missing, possibly left behind or lost during the march. Moylan recalled Curtis being sent back to retrieve his belongings, accompanied by 4 men, Rooney, Brown, Bruce, and another soldier. Along the way, the small party encountered 3 Cheyenne warriors rifling through the abandoned pack. These warriors were likely part of Little Wolf's band from Red Cloud's agency and could have been the same men who had spotted the regiment earlier. Curtis and his men successfully drove off the Cheyenne warriors, but were unable to prevent them from later attempting to warn the nearby Sioux village. Moylan's account indicates that Curtis was sent back by the time the command halted at the foot of the divide, though it's reasonable to believe that Curtis discovered the missing pack during the first halt. This first halt lasted approximately 6 hours, during which time the soldiers rested, made fires, and ate breakfast. The second halt, however, was much shorter, only about an hour and a half, and lacked the same level of comfort. It's likely that Curtis, wanting to secure his gear before another night's march, was anxious to retrieve his belongings during this more extended pause. Despite Moylan's recounting being a second-hand story, passed along the chain of command from Curtis to Yates, then to Keogh and Cook, the incident seems plausible and was probably reported early on, shortly after the command moved out. Historian Richard Hardorf suggested that the distance Curtis traveled back to retrieve his pack was 5 miles, but more precise calculations indicate it was closer to 4.5 miles. Curtis's decision to return and retrieve his gear before reaching the second halt shows his foresight in securing essential supplies before the uncertainty of the next day's events. Although the details of this incident are often pieced together from various testimonies, it fits within the broader narrative of disorganization and logistical struggles that plagued Custer's regiment in the hours leading up to the battle. These small moments of confusion and disruption contributed to the mounting tension within the command, underscoring the precarious situation they faced as they prepared to engage the Sioux and Cheyenne forces. The timing of Sergeant William Curtis's round trip to retrieve his missing gear likely took less than an hour, as you suggest, given the distances involved, approximately 4.5 miles each way. This fits into the broader timeline and explains why Custer would have had a few extra minutes atop Crow's Nest Hill before descending to rejoin his officers. During this brief window, Custer would have been receiving updates, including Curtis's findings, which would have made their way up the chain of command, possibly leading to further discussions among the officers. The debated story of Tom Custer and Jim Calhoun riding out to report Curtis's findings to George Custer adds another layer of complexity to the timeline. According to this account, George greeted them with the infamous line, "Tom, who in the devil moved these troops forward? My orders were to remain in camp all day and attack the Indians at night, but they've discovered us and are on the run." This quote, though widely circulated, remains contested. Author Bruce Liddick has suggested that Custer may have simply forgotten to cancel his original orders for the troops to prepare to march, leading to confusion within the command. Liddick's theory posits that Custer had instructed Adjutant William Cook to keep the troops in camp, but the movement continued anyway, possibly due to miscommunication or Custer's own oversight. Lieutenant Godfrey's recollections lend credence to this theory, as he remembered Custer telling everyone to prepare to move, but without issuing a definitive order. This ambiguity in Custer's command style may have contributed to the confusion that followed. Meanwhile, Varnum, who is considered a relatively reliable source, claimed that he witnessed the regiment arriving and heard George Custer admonishing Tom and Calhoun for leaving the column. While elements of this story may be exaggerated or misremembered, Varnum's credibility lends weight to the notion that some version of this exchange occurred. The sequence of events paints a picture of confusion and miscommunication within the regiment. The previous day, Custer was fully aware of the presence of the Sioux along the Little Bighorn, and he had made the bold decision to order a night march. This was a risky move, especially considering the logistical issues the regiment was facing with their pack mules and baggage. Moving 7 miles in complete darkness, over unfamiliar terrain, and often at a trot, put additional strain on the troops and their animals. This rapid movement also risked disrupting the cohesion of the unit, as officers and scouts alike struggled to navigate the rugged terrain without clear visibility. Custer's decision to conduct a night march, combined with the confusion over his orders the following morning, suggests a commander attempting to seize an opportunity for surprise, but at the cost of disorganization. The lack of clarity in communication, both in the timing of orders and the movement of troops, reflects the challenges Custer faced in managing his regiment during a fast-paced and evolving situation. These moments of miscommunication and confusion would ultimately contribute to the unraveling of Custer's strategy, setting the stage for the catastrophic events that followed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn.